All right, welcome to part 3 of module 7. So we're looking at motivation, emotion, and personality still. Today we're going to be talking about sexual motivation. So the first piece to understand is just what is sexual motivation? What is this referring to? And basically it is just the normal human interest in sexual objects and activities. So a pretty broad definition there. Now, one thing that's really important to understand about sexual motivation as opposed to like hunger motivation or even things like achievement or affiliation motivation is sexual motivation is not a need, or sex is not a need, but rather it's a desire. So one of the big differences is that when we talk about sexual motivation and the sex drive, right, it is something that can be suppressed. We can basically suppress these urges and eventually those urges subside. This is not true for something like hunger, right? And I'm sure you've all experienced this before, right? And when you're feeling hungry and you're like, okay, I just don't have anything to eat, or there's no way I can eat, and you kind of start feeling hungrier and hungrier and hungrier and hungrier, right? And it just kind of becomes all-consuming until you finally eat. That's kind of showing the difference between a desire versus a need, right? Something we want versus something that we have to have. And the kind of the nature push and how strong that push is when we're looking at something like hunger versus sexual motivation. Now, again, this interest is a normal interest. It's something we expect, but it is kind of important to draw that distinction there. This is just kind of looking at a bunch of different kind of patterns that we see in men and women when it comes to sexual motivation. Now, again, these are broad patterns. These are not meant to connect with every single individual man and every single individual woman, but it's more of a broad thing that we tend to see. And in class we have more of an in-depth conversation trying to think about, how does evolution explain these things? If we think about how evolution works, what could some evolutionary explanations be? Now, obviously, these don't all have to be explained evolutionarily. Some of them could very much be social or cultural influences that are causing these different patterns, but we'll kind of pursue them through that evolutionary line. So just to kind of run through some of the differences we tend to see is men tend to be more interested in sex and initiate and think about sex more often. Women tend to be less interested in sex. Men are more likely to want sex with more partners, where women are not as interested in sex with many partners. Men desire sex without emotional commitment, where women are more likely to desire sex with emotional commitment. When picking a sex partner, men are more likely to focus on youth and physical attractiveness, and women are more likely to focus on social and economic status. And then lastly, men feel more jealous when the partner is physically unfaithful, where women feel more jealous when the partner is emotionally unfaithful. Now, again, these are all general patterns that we tend to see in men and women. There could obviously be social influences as well as evolutionary influences. These are just kind of generalities that we expect to see or we have seen in people. So the physiology of sex. So obviously, just like with hunger, there is a physical, biological drive that is connected to sex and sexual behavior. So sexual behavior in general is affected by the levels of sexual hormones produced by the gonads, which are our reproductive organs, right? So in women, they are the ovaries. In men, they are the testes. Okay, those are our gonads. They're producing not only our like actual reproductive cells, sperm and eggs, but also reproducing the hormones that are considered the sex hormones. So the sex hormones in men are testosterone. So testosterone has been linked with sex drive in both men and women. One thing that's important to remember is that men and women both have testosterone and estrogen in them. It's not like we only have one or the other. The difference tends to generally be that men will have higher levels of testosterone than women overall, and women will have higher levels of estrogen than men overall. Okay, but we both have both. Again, testosterone is linked with sex drive. Sexual activity increases testosterone levels, and testosterone levels increase sex drive. So you can kind of see there's kind of this cyclical link with testosterone, right? sexual activity sexual activity is going to increase those testosterone levels. That increases the sex drive, which is likely to increase sexual activity. So it's kind of a cycle there. Estrogen, which is considered the female sex hormone, again, it is in both. We know it's going to peak during ovulation. So that's where it's at its highest level, and then it will kind of drop down when not ovulating, then it'll go back up. So there's kind of this cycle again. And obviously this goes, if we're talking about ovulation, goes with the menstrual cycle, right? It's going to go on that same cycle there. Then we get to what is called the sexual response cycle. You guys will watch this video in class to kind of get an example of what all of these different pieces are. The sexual response cycle is the stages of human sexual interaction. So basically, when there is sexual interaction, there will be these 5 stages, or this would be all of the 5 stages that there could be. So there is the excitement stage, which is the first one. There is the plateau stage, the orgasm phase, the resolution phase, and the refractory period. Basically, excitement is exactly what it sounds like. It's the excitement stage. Plateau is generally considered actual sexual intercourse. Eventually, that leads to the orgasm phase. Again, exactly what it sounds like, the orgasm. Resolution phase is kind of the and like once the orgasm is over, it's basically where your body is kind of like recovering I don't want to say recovering, but it's basically kind of coming back down to normal, right? You were excited, your arousal was very high, it's going to drop down to more normal levels. Then we have what's called the refractory period, which is basically the time in between the resolution phase and when the excitement phase could start again, right? So there's kind of go through these 5 cycles. One thing I should mention, with these, you really just need to know in general what's happening. So you don't have to like be able to explain the physical or biological or physiological things that are happening at each stage. But you just need to know in general, okay, what happens, what leads into what stage, what overall is going on, and then what the next stage would be. That's all the parts that they'll look for when they ask about this question. So obviously, we've kind of looked at a lot of the physiological aspects of sex and sexual motivation, but again, there are obviously psychological aspects as well. So one of the big ones is external stimuli, and this is really where psychologists would probably focus a lot of their efforts on, is external stimuli. So external stimuli just refers to anything that we see or hear or a specific situation that can excite us, that can put us into that excitement stage of that cycle, right? Again, there's a giant variety of things that would fit into this. So anything that would fit into those categories. There's actually an interesting video that I'm going to have you guys watch, or you can watch it right here. That's very interesting. It kind of as different psychologists talking about external stimuli. Now, they're going to focus specifically on pornography or sexually explicit material as the external stimuli that they're talking about, because it's been linked to a lot of very negative effects. So some of them that you can see, so for example, when we have a lot of viewing, and again, this isn't like, I saw a magazine one time, now I have these horrible things that are coming up, right? It's more of like prolonged exposure to different sexually explicit material can cause negative effects, right? So for example, men can think that women like being raped, or might view their spouse less favorably. We also know that viewing X-rated films diminish people's satisfaction with their own sexual partner, as well as desensitize us. So these are kind of some patterns that we can see through exposure to these different external stimuli. And again, they're focusing on specific types, but psychology in general will look at a much broader variety. In addition to external stimuli, we also obviously have imagined stimuli. So imagined stimuli is our brain, right? Or the brain is said to be our most significant sex organ. Imagined stimuli can cause sexual arousal and sexual desire just as well as external stimuli. So we can basically see all of these same kind of reactions from something that's imagined, something that's internal in our minds, as well as something that's literally physically happening. Sex and relationships is the last piece. So sex later in life, after decommitment and in a relationship, showed both greater relational and sexual satisfaction. So this is kind of connected with when we talked about development in adolescence, and one of the things that was that we mentioned was that you're more likely to have negative relational outcomes if you date really early, right? The younger you start dating, the more likely you are to have negative relational outcomes. We can see kind of the same thing when it comes to sex. So generally speaking, when we're looking at that, a later, deeper connection, deeper commitment relationship is going to have better outcomes for both the relationship itself, right? So having sex later when we have that deeper commitment and when we have the stronger bond and the stronger relationship actually makes the relationship better. So you'll have greater relation satisfaction. So you'll feel happier in that relationship as well as sexual satisfaction. So you're actually is also linked to feeling more satisfied with your sex life as well. So it's just, again, patterns that we see with certain behaviors and where they're kind of linked with what happens later on in our lives. That's going to wrap up our whole conversation. This one's pretty quick. So again, take a few moments, do a quick summary about just some of the pieces that we saw with sexual motivation, and then I'll see you guys in the next video.